Our next guest tonight is Peter Ebsworth. Peter is the editor of South Bank Poetry magazine, which specialises in publishing poems with an urban theme. It started off as centering on London, but it spread its wings, so poems with an urban theme based in almost any city you can think of will be considered for inclusion. I think that's the editorial policy.
Sure, yeah. And the odd quirky one.
And the odd quirky one as well. I'd also say that Peter has very generously brought along several poetry magazines here tonight, which are on the sofa, and you're welcome to take one home for free. Or two. Maybe two. There are also some books for sale here as well, some copies of South Bank Poetry magazine, one or two other things. But without further ado, well, a little bit more further ado actually, because I wanted to say that Peter has a book out.
Later in the year.
Yes, I was going to say that, Peter. Later in the year, Peter has a book out called Crap's Last Tape, the Musical. So look forward to hearing more about that. But also, the next South Bank Poetry magazine will be launched here at the Poetry Cafe on the 31st of July, which is a Friday. So if you can hold all that information in your head, please give a big welcome to Peter Ebsworth.
Okay, I'm going to start with a few war poems and then lighten the tone afterwards. Not that they're that heavy anyway. But the first one is about my grandfather, whom I never met, who operated a Lewis gun in the First World War. It's called The Goat. My grandfather, Francis Audley Ebsworth, drank 2 bottles of Johnny Walker a day and his 2 grocers' shops into the ground. He blamed his chronic drinking on being gassed. If they'd had a really good week's takings at the one in the Walworth Road, he'd announce, "We're off to Norfolk." Then he and my dad Ben would cab it all the way there. Sometimes, before he blacked out, Francis Audley would tell his son how he had to take breaks and piss on his machine gun to cool it down before he could kill more of the Hun. At home they kept a goat who'd eat anything, including newspapers. One day, approaching middle age, he ate a Daily Express too many and his stomach exploded. And the next 3, which yeah, that's a true story. Sadly. So sorry for the goat. The more I read that. The next 3 are about my brother's experiences in the Second World War, and I would add that my brother is masses older than me. Seriously. It was a massive mistake as well, I think. Okay, there's a series of 3, so if you're going to clap at the end of the 3, I think. The first one is called The Anxieties of Conflict. During the Blitz, my brother Derek would sometimes go through house rubble the next day. After school, he'd search for anything useful to bring back home. A knife or fork, a glass, a piece of unbroken crockery. A rare find of torn parachute bits was especially prized to show Mum, as she'd briefly worked in a factory which assembled them. Dad joked how she wasn't very good at it, said, "Pity the poor sod who got one of hers." If Derek was late home for his tea, Mum would wait behind the front door and, as he came in, whack him on the head with a wooden serving spoon. Now she'd probably be charged for child cruelty. Now Derek is 82, always laughs when he talks about it. Her ringing in his ears, the danger warnings reinforced and still sometimes ignored, but fully understood long before now. The second one is called 1940. Being the young scamp he was, just turned 7 years old on April 10th, 1940, my older brother Derek, bored as the wartime summer approached, would mess around in parks with other children. Some he knew, others not. As the days got longer in June and school finished earlier, Often alone in the afternoon, he'd linger around the edge of ponds by wasteland, looking for urban flotsam. Never found anything more exciting than the odd battered ball or broken toy he'd hook out by hand, but it helped to kill time and postpone any breaking bad news he might hear when he got home. One such pond was full of rank green and yellow slime, myriad insects and flies, hosted by dead birds and rats. He caught diphtheria there at a very bad time for our family. Mum's only brother, Jack, 19 years old, a navigator in the RAF, was called back from his break after completing 30 Pathfinder missions. On 9th of June 1940, Sergeant John Charles Phipp of 82 Squadron failed to return until much later, when his name was listed on a screen wall in Chingford Mount Cemetery. Worse happened when Derek's Nana Maud, unable to cope with Jack's death, died the same month. The diphtheria was killing Derek. It seemed there was no hope. Then Nana Maud came to him in his hospital bed as if alive again, smiled and spoke to reassure him. She was happy, persuaded him to go back and live. He fought the fever, rallied and fully recovered. Certain that Maud came back and saved his life, Derek's always sworn it really happened. He's as sure could be, as Jack used to say, as sure as powdered eggs. And the final one of those three is called War Bonds. When Ben was stationed at Beeston in Nottinghamshire, he'd be granted weekend leave at short notice and wouldn't arrive back in Walthamstow until very late on a Friday. His wife Rosa was glad to see him, but always went back to bed. Not one for a night appetite, her share got saved to cook on Saturday. This left Ben to take his excited son Derek into the kitchen to watch him fry fish and chips, properly battered. The quality of the fish was the best available. As before Ben had switched to the meat trade in the mid-1930s, his job was to drive lorries full of it, on ice, from Felixstowe to Billingsgate. He'd kept up good contacts, and his best friend George had become a cold store manager, so a detour on the way home was well worth it. 8, 9 or 10 years old, Derek loved this wartime treat, would even eat the hardest cracklings he insisted Dad scrape off the bottom of the pan, despite their bitter taste. During the times Dad was away, Derek collected small pieces of enemy shrapnel to show him. Some, which hadn't fully cooled down, made burn holes in his hanky. That's the 3 war packs. And the next one is about men of a certain age who should know better. It's called Boomer Noir. I'd felt as old and out of place as the Angus Steakhouse in Leicester Square. Until 50 became the new 40, 60 became the new 45. And my daughter Katie joked at her 40th party, "Gee Dad, the way things are going, you'll soon be younger than me." I inwardly glowed with the glamour of my new status, licensed to look at women in the old way again, which had to be fatal, and it was. Julie, my mistress of 30 years ago, made contact. "Peter, we must meet. Everything's changed. Now the grandchildren have grown up and left home. We can soon finally be together." I wanted a down payment to show she meant business. We arranged to meet in the alley by the bottom of her South Coast suburban garden. I felt meek as soon as her lips located my big what's-it. And as I gazed at the baubles on her pink fluffy slippers, he thinks I've just popped out to empty the rubbish. She bent down again to clean me up with a moist wipe she put into a plastic bag. It was a nice touch and I really appreciated it, until her husband Jim was found with his head caved in, my DNA all over the backs of his thighs. There was no proof I'd ever known Julie, and the judge was scathing when I denied ever meeting Jim, telling the jury, Everyone leads a double life these days. Later found out Julie used the life insurance to move to France with a new lover. I still had a hard spot for her, which hurt my body as I lay on the concrete floor in the heat of the cell. One day got an El Greco postcard with no message, and remembered a conversation with Julie about art, when after I'd asked what nationality he was, she'd looked at me in an unusual way. Over the years, I've thought about that a lot. That's about it for my 10 minutes. Okay.
Well, that was Peter Ebsworth. I don't think the jury's out. Give him another round of applause.